Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today I want to post a little about what I read in late May and the first few days of June, as well as what I'm currently finishing. In my last couple of videos, I've talked about how the Black Lives Matter protests are shaping my thinking and my experiences right now. Most of the books I'm going to talk about today were read or at least planned before the protest really got underway. Two that were not on my list, I talked about in my last video. Both books are about the anti-Black race riots that happened in the United States in 1919, although they were written in very different ways. The first is Eve Ewing's 1919, a series of poems about the riots in Chicago that summer, the quote, Red Summer, when riots and massacres broke out in many cities and towns throughout the country. Each of her powerful poems responds to particular lines from an historical document. I'll link in the details box to that video, and I really encourage you not only to read Ewing's poetry, but to hear her read them aloud and talk about them. You can click through from my previous video, or I'm sure you can find many other examples of her readings if you search for her name. Anyway, in that video, I also talk a bit about the context of the riots and about a book aimed at young readers, A Few Red Drops by Claire Hartfield, a book which is a great supplement to Ewing's poetry collection. I recently completed a buddy read with Sean the Book Maniac of Momaday by Gloria and Naylor. Let me preface my comments by first saying what a pleasure it was to read with Sean. Back in the very early 1990s, I read all of Gloria Naylor's books, finding them all to be powerful reads, even the books that were fairly contained and quiet. But my favorite back then was Momaday. I was totally blown away, and I shared it with my sweetie at the time, a person who was not much of a reader yet, and he loved it too. Honestly, it was one of the books that formed the backbone or spine of our early relationship, and that relationship has lasted. I grew up along the coast of South Carolina, near where Momaday herself lives in the novel. David was from New York, just as was the character George. I did not live in a particularly isolated area, and I was not part of Black culture, much less part of Gullah culture, which I'm not sure Naylor names, but that's what she's talking about. But Gullah culture had a huge shaping force on all of South Carolina lowcountry culture, even though a lot of whites living there did not or would not recognize it. Back to the book. I had not read Momaday in almost 30 years, and I was heartbroken to find that it was far less meaningful to me now. There's still a lot to love about it. I love the characters of Momaday and her sister Abigail, and I really enjoyed some of the other community members living on the independent island between South Carolina and Georgia. But I was not so fond of some of the references and portrayals of queer sexuality, and it totally took me off guard. Naylor authored The Women of Brewster Place, a book that normalized a lesbian character at a time when that was still relatively rare in mainstream novels. Granted, the flippant insults to gay men are a very minor part of the book, but they happen a lot in the early section, and it was off-putting. There are some other kinds of similar things, not about sexuality, that made the book feel dated. For those of you who know anything about my typical reading taste, you know I read a lot of books that are a lot more dated than Momaday, but many of them feel dated only in their ideas about race and gender or anything else, and in their plot lines, etc., not in their actual writing style, which often feels pretty timeless. I'm sure you have no idea what I mean by that, but I can't figure out how to explain what I mean. Here, Naylor seems to be writing in order to be hip at the time of publication. That's not something that could really have been awkward at the time, I guess, but it is what her prose made me feel this reading. And I guess the writing style of Jane Austen or Charlotte Bronte is also really dated and stilted. But since I don't remember it, I never used it myself, it doesn't feel as embarrassing as it does here. Finally, I think I may just be too old, and maybe just too married for a long time, to particularly enjoy the cheesy romance scenes. This is really the first book that I've reread and had a totally different response to, and it's a little heartbreaking. But despite the fact that the book didn't really work for me, I know it's partly because I had put it on such a high pedestal for all those years. Many people read it now and feel exactly like I did when I read it 30 years ago. Give it a try if you haven't read it or haven't read it recently, and let me know what you think. Okay, on to the next set of books. May was the month of MaybeMidrash. Follow the hashtag to Jason's playlist of everyone's post. Many are really fascinating. I started by reading Marilynne Robinson. Her book, Housekeeping, has been one of my favorites for a long time, and I reread it this January, so I know it's still up there for me. But I had never read any of her Gilead books, so I picked up the first one this month, and it was quietly lovely. I say quietly, even though it resounds and resounds after finishing it. Winding throughout the book is the theme of the meaning of fatherhood, what it means to be a parent, what it means to be a child, in all sorts of literal and metaphorical and theological ways. As I've said before, I am a secular Jew, so the worldview of the pastor narrator is really different from my own. I often shy away from people who quote scripture at me or try to persuade me that I should believe what they do, although I certainly understand that people all have different sorts of beliefs and practices that are very meaningful to them, and I respect people enormously who live up to their own beliefs. And Robinson creates that kind of character, one who accepts the beliefs of those around him with no assumption that he knows the only true path. He lives his faith very deeply and shares his beliefs with the recipient of his letter, as well as with the readers of the novel, in such an open-hearted and accepting way that even people who vehemently disagree with his ideas can find this novel extraordinarily insightful, I think. I'm eager to go on to the next books set in the same community. I've gone on a bit here already, but I want to mention that parts of the book are efforts to consider how the white community can be allies in the face of racial injustice. It might be an interesting book for people to be thinking about in these terms right now. After I finished Robinson's gorgeous book, I picked up a digital copy from my library's site of the proceedings of a theological conversation about Robinson's series. I fairly quickly put it down. First, I haven't read the other books in the soon-to-be quartet of Gilead books, and the essays in the collection refer to events and character development that I don't yet know. Second, it might be over my head theologically. I'm ready to learn, but I need a real copy, I think. My version of Balm and Gilead could not be read anywhere other than my tiny phone, and I could not concentrate enough to absorb some of the more complicated passages when I could only see a few words at a time. Maybe the library building will reopen and interlibrary loan service resume before MaybeMidrash rolls around next year. If so, I think I might give it a go again. I finished 3 nonfiction books for MaybeMidrash, all of which I enjoyed, but none of which will appear on my favorite 2020 reads. The first was Dani Shapiro's memoir, Devotion. I had high hopes for this one, but found it to be spiritual in the loosest sense, and not to be deeply resonant throughout. I said I was secular, and that extends even to thinking about yoga in spiritual ways. Shapiro is on a search, and she goes in a lot of directions without ever really seeming to be committed to understanding anything. That might be unfair. There are quite a few sections I found quite meaningful. Hearing her talk about her family's fear of continuing to live in New York City after 9/11 was quite poignant, and she more or less acknowledges the position of economic privilege that allowed them to make those choices. Her discussions of her child's illness in the moment and in later years is heartbreaking. and her discussion of trying on her father's tefillin after his death, as a liberal rabbi recommended as a way to connect with him, is fascinating. Tefillin are objects used in daily prayers by observant Jewish men. And she talks honestly about how her experience felt at moments to connect her to him, and yet at other moments to distance her from his practice of Judaism, to transgress against his beliefs, in fact. She could have been more forthcoming, I think, about the complexity of even those storylines, honestly. The book as a whole did not carry me all the way through. Next, I read A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis. This is a beautiful book, if you're in the right place for it. As I'm sure you know, Lewis was a very religious man, and the questions and the times of discomfort and the kinds of peace he finds are quite powerful. But I can't read about grief, especially widowhood, without taking it a bit personally. A story I don't want to get into right here now, and his story is so different from the kind of grief I can imagine experiencing. Have you read books that you know were powerful and meaningful, but that you just couldn't absorb when you were reading it because it felt both too similar and too different? If you're up for discussing that with a stranger, I'd love to hear. Finally, for my MaybeMidrash choices, I read the new book, Thin Places, by Jordan Kisner. I think I may try to write a formal review of the book, so I'll hold off talking about it too much here. Only parts of the book are about Kisner's faith. I wasn't crazy about the book as a whole, but I found Kisner's big picture presented in a really interesting way. Her general conceit is to explore moments where we assign clear and distinct boundaries between two things. In other words, we create a binary. But that border is actually quite permeable, and one can travel back and forth across those lines, or even live in both worlds. Or to be more accurate, I guess, there really is no line at all. I do sound a lot less positive about my reading experiences this month, don't I? It's been a hard month. Well, there are 3 more small books I finished, plus one I'm reading right now. I mentioned on an earlier video that I've been cleaning stacks of books and rearranging my shelves. Well, I ran across Toni Morrison's 1992 Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination on one of my grad school shelves. I read Playing in the Dark when it first came out and found it absolutely eye-opening. This is a short and accessible book of literary theory, really. Morrison points out how much of what makes for iconic American fiction is a construction of whiteness or masculinity or freedom in opposition to white authors' constructions of Black Americans. In other words, whites are made powerful by casting blacks as subjugated. In reality, of course, but also in narrative and words. I reread this book in one huge gulp, standing in the basement by my history shelves. I went back and forth thinking how creative and insightful Morrison was at every single moment, and thinking, yes, of course. This book, with the works of scholars like Edward Said, which I read afterwards, completely shaped my literary consciousness at the time. I had forgotten many of the great nuances of her work, but not its underlying interpretation. I couldn't imagine life without it. One of my favorite things about this book is that it is, in some ways, a reclamation of the canon. Morrison isn't out to condemn these books, from authors like Faulkner and Willa Cather and Edgar Allan Poe and Ernest Hemingway. She wants us to read them, and to read them with the awareness of the way race and blackness work in those books. I think I'll need to read this one again, perhaps in just a few months, much more carefully, with pencil in hand. The last 2 books I finished were both by Annie Ernaux, an author I had not read before. Both are extremely short, and both I listened to on audiobook, courtesy of my library's digital collections. The first was A Woman's Story, and the second, A Man's Place, although I suspect it might be better to read them in the opposite order if you have both available to you. And I gather there's a volume that might fit in the middle as well, actually. Both books are about the deaths of her parents and about growing up with them, struggling against educational experiences and class, and how they shaped how Ernaux saw the world in ways quite different from the way her parents grew up. Ernaux writes with a steely fragility, and she does so in a way that feels really self-aware and writerly. I gather that people often call her work autofiction rather than memoir, and I think I have to go read more about what the difference is, because it wasn't apparent to me. Any ideas? Whatever the difference is, the author writes what seems both very personal and very honest. She tries to understand both of her parents as full human beings, without sentimentalizing their lives and deaths. I'm eager to read more of and to listen to more of Ernaux's words. All right, I'll mention one more thing. Last month, I was a couple of weeks late finishing and then posting about Song of Solomon, the April book for Toni Morrison 2020. This month, I'm running behind again, catching up on the May read, Tar Baby. Within a week or so, I should have up a video discussion about it specifically. This month's read is Beloved, another one of those books I have loved ever since it was published. I'm looking forward to the reread, and I hope I'll finish reading it so I can post about it immediately after the end of the month. Well, I hope you're doing as well as you can be, filling your TBRs with interesting books that give you a lot to think about, help you grow in whatever way, and help you move forward. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books.